And welcome back to All Things Conflict. I'm Maria Arpa, your host, talking about conflict in the workplace. And today I have Adrian Pagdin with me. Adrian, we met a few weeks ago. We were introduced by a mutual friend. I loved our conversation, and I hope that we can sort of draw on that connection and some of the wisdom that you have to bring to conflict in the workplace.
Great, Maria, thank you. And thanks for inviting me. Yeah, similarly, really enjoyed our conversation and looking forward to chatting more and let's say sharing wisdom.
So I suppose the first thing is really for our listeners is if you could explain a little about, your history and all that lovely stuff you shared with me about purpose and what you were doing before, and then how that, the things that happened when it all changed. But go right back for me.
Thanks, Maria. Do you know, I think I'll go one step back. And in 2020, I started working for a company many people will have heard of called Unilever. And I worked in the leadership development team, but I was responsible for the leadership retreat. So 2 residential retreats, one in Kingston and one in Singapore. And when I say responsible for, there were some physical refurbishments going on, but there was also a rebranding exercise. And at that time, Unilever was very focused on purpose, and as in being a purpose-led business. For 10 years, they'd done a really good job of delivering on sustainable development goals that aligned with the UN's development goals. And so they were really into purpose. And when I joined them, I'd come from a background of hospitality and a lot of training and front office banking situations. And for me, purpose was a little bit wishy-washy. And so I was invited to go on a purpose workshop. Now, this purpose workshop at the time had been rolled out to about 50,000 people across the organization. This was something voluntary. You couldn't be nominated to go on it. You put your hand up and you went on it. And so as part of the leadership development team, I thought I should go on it. And it was a really, I don't want to use the word transformational, but it had a lot of impact for me. Because while I wouldn't have considered myself to have been, I don't think purpose would have been my vocabulary. I'd always been curious about myself, about my impact on the world. And as a result of that workshop, I came out of it thinking, or at least knowing myself better. And when people ask me to describe myself, I think probably like lots of people, Maria, we end up with a job title. I'm a general manager, I'm a leader, I'm a project manager. But actually, as a result of that and subsequent years of working with purpose activists, I realized that I'm a facilitator. I've got a lot of skills and experiences. I've been a hotelier. I used to run hotels. I've been a leader of brands and of businesses. I've had my own business a couple of times. I am a facilitator. I've done lots of leadership development and training. I'm a coach, I'm a counselor. But really what I do is I bring people together and I facilitate transformation. So for me, a baker, sailor, a relationship maker, I like to bake, but it's about service. I like to sail, but actually it's about adventure. And I like to create relationships, but actually it's about bringing people together. And people had very meaningful conversations about how we could activate this at work and how we could genuinely contribute towards this overall sense of purpose at Unilever. So I was interested about how we could share that in the wider world. The idea was, let's bring like-minded organizations and people together, and let's see if we can collaborate. And let's see if we can, do what's happening at Unilever in different organizations. So do well, but do it the right way. And that PIA continues today. The intention is to inspire 1 million people to embark on a journey of reconnecting with the things that bring about sustainable happiness, health, peace, meaning, and purpose in their lives. And then into that void came an individual who I suppose I reported to him, and we just had a personality clash. And it's interesting because you and I talk about conflict, and I don't like conflict. I don't know if anybody does, right? But I don't like conflicts. And so I actively seek to resolve it. And I think over the years, I've become reasonably good at it. I can generally find areas of agreement. I can find spaces where we can come together. There's something that that we can build on. And with this person, and I guess he would have a different story or a similar story. There was some conflict there, and it didn't go well. I don't suppose it went well for either of us, but I was not in a position of power, and I felt very compromised and also quite confused, because here I was in an organization where I'd been for 2 years at that point, and I'd only ever met leaders who were genuinely authentic, purposeful, good people. They were considered, they were considerate. And here I was with somebody who was acting in a way that was very incongruent with those values, and certainly leadership values that I had experienced in Unilever. And so I found myself with half of the year gone, so kind of halfway through 2022, I beg your pardon, needing to go, but also needing to finish the job. So I wanted to make sure that the site was complete. There would be a transformation there, and I did that. But it was a time that was quite damaging. I think I was quite burnt out. I think a lot of people talk about burnout, and my research is it really is a physical thing. And I think I was quite worn by the end of that experience, and it took me probably a year of reflection to be able to look back at it without being angry, and to look back on it, reflect on it as a positive learning experience. Not about that I'm going to be a stronger person, but that objectives sometimes change, goals sometimes change, but the only thing that we've got is our consistent authenticity. And when you take away some of those pillars, some of those connections that sustain us, and then in the case I'm talking about, with people that sustain me in the organization, but also we got to really importantly remember that our energy comes a little bit from work, meaningful work, but from other things. And I think I'd neglected those other things. And I think that was what my reflections were in that year afterwards, was if it's not meaningful work, or even if the work is challenging, what is it that brings me sustainable energy and happiness? And that is community, connections to people, contributing to something bigger than myself, and being in nature. That was a very, very long answer to your very simple question, I think, Maria.
Oh, it was really wonderful. It was, I was sort of riveted by the eloquence, so there were lots of things going off in me as you were speaking. And, one of those things was the power of the reflections and the work that you must have done to be able to speak about these things that happened in the not too distant past. I did hear you say, I don't talk about it. I'm not angry about it anymore. I can still bitch and moan about things that happened to me 30 or 40 years ago. So, and with a power, behind it, with a real charge. But there was something in the description of what happened, and that took me to two places. One was, share some of the secrets of what you went through and what you're doing. And the other was about when you're working somewhere and you're with a group of people, and it's all, idyllic's probably too strong a word, but, aligned. That's probably where things feel very aligned. And then how, one person or a small group of people can just come in and knock it all over. And the sense of having the rug pulled from under you, and suddenly everything that you had attached yourself to, for the purposes of doing a good job, whatever a good job is, but for the purposes of making things better, how then suddenly nothing holds true anymore, and how that must mess with you. So I think it was those two things, and maybe you could speak to that second one first about having the rug pulled or what that's like for people in the way that you see it now, and then maybe we can go into with the time that we have. What is it? What's in there that you could, in such a short space of time, be able to look back and what are you giving people, and all of that.
Yeah, of course, Maria. It's interesting that you said about having the rug pulled out from underneath you. And I think you said something else, I think about truths. I think therein lies the challenge. I think we all deal with adversity. I think the word resilience is so well used at the moment. And it's something that blessedly lots of people from a coaching and leadership point of view, we understand about how to develop and support resilience. But those are all generally dealing with things that are more black and white. You lose a job, you gain a job, you didn't get that promotion, somebody isn't nice to you. I think where the truth is called into question is where it becomes much more challenging. And so for me, it was having had such a strong vision that was really aligned. And I remember being told to stop at one point. I was posting on social media about these beliefs that we had, that we had a story to tell, that people with purpose grow and companies with purpose thrive and organizations with purpose last. And I was saying all these things, and the chief communications officer I'd never even met, she called me up and she said, "Adrian, you don't know who I am, but I know who you are, and you need to stop." And it was brilliant, because we had a very candid conversation about what I was doing. He said, "Okay, I understand. You need to talk to me." And I kept getting encouraged to keep going until someone tells you to stop. So I was obviously doing things right. And then having a really candid conversation, having 10 minutes with the chief HR officer, who is now the CEO of a very famous brand, and presenting to her this idea that, well, we've got this potential to take what we've been doing here and to really leverage it globally. I've been doing this research. And she said, "I think 1 million people is not enough. We need to make it 10 million. And we need to, we as Unilever, need to make this a social commitment." And so, Maria, I'd been there for 2 years. I had this genuine sense that what we were doing was the right thing and was being encouraged every way. And then I think, for reasons that anyone that is familiar with Unilever's more recent story will understand, there were some changes in personnel, and throughout that year of late 2022, 23, things started to change. And again, people losing their jobs, all of the kind of black and white adversity that we used to do. But for me, it was suddenly being faced with a situation where I didn't have any of that support, and I was being questioned about why I was doing something that I'd felt like everybody knew what I was doing, and I had so much support, and having my truths questioned. Why are you doing this? Are you doing this for personal goal? What's in this for you? And I think that's the bit that becomes very caustic, very damaging. And I think your resilience is really tested, because I suppose for me, resilience is about bouncing back from a fall. But if you don't know when you've hit the bottom, it's hard to bounce back, right? So every time you think, "Oh, that was bad, but I can then there's another one." And suddenly there's foundations of beliefs that you've built this kind of enterprise on are being called into question. That's really difficult. And, I'm sure that with the listeners, you'll have some people that have been through that. I hope not many, to be honest, because while not unusual, it's very destabilizing to be dealing with a situation where your truths are questioned. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes. When your truth is questioned, when your intentions, I think it's the worst thing we can do to another human being is challenge their integrity or their intentions with no evidence, without being able to say, and this, like clear, communicable, evidence of something. But to literally just tell someone that their intentions are dishonorable, is probably the worst place you could, and especially where there are power imbalances in especially in workplaces. And I know I'm reminded of I'm probably completely unemployable. I could never make an employee anymore because my propensity for speaking truth to power has often got me into a lot of trouble. And I am reminded of times where I've been, doing something and on a journey, and it seems that everybody's on board with the other side until something pops up that nobody wanted to hear, because what the work I do brings everything to the surface. And it always never fails to surprise me how many people get threatened by that or feel threatened by that. But then you're in this situation where you have less power, and then the rug's pulled from under you or things change, and then suddenly you're not being treated for the real, authentic human being that you are. All sorts of things are being visited on you that aren't you. And the vision I have is like quicksand, where you and there's sort of no way up. And every time you try to pull yourself up, you're sucked further down.
Yeah.
And when I heard you talk about, do you know when you've hit the bottom? One of the ways I talk about this is, in all our situations, wherever we are, if we're going to develop resilience or whatever. And I'm really interested in how you bounce off of this, is I need to know if I were to fall over in the family, at home, at work, with my friends, in the band or whatever, is it going to be a soft landing? That's one of the ways in which we can work out whether we need support or not. Because if you can't be sure that you've got a soft landing when you mess up or make a mistake or fall over, then you're not safe.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that's one of our responsibilities as leaders, how large or small your team is to create an environment where people can fail and that you fail together. Now, obviously, we don't be failing all the time, Maria, but when we do fail, because failure is a sign of effort and endeavor and experimentation, that we have a soft landing. And the piece that I would probably add was that it wasn't idyllic, but it was a pretty impressive place to work for a few years. And some of the colleagues that had been there for that entire 10 years throughout, some of the really amazing times at Unilever, they really did talk about a place where you were encouraged to seek out failure, where leaders were really developed to understand the importance of authenticity, of the difference between delegation and abdication, right? And it was a tremendous place. So then I think, to complete the mental picture, what you've got to try and imagine is that suddenly it's as if that didn't exist, as if for 2 years you'd had all of that experience, and then suddenly everyone you're talking to, well, with some exceptions, but a lot of people you're talking to, they're suddenly acting differently. And that's incongruent. And I think incongruence is something that's very challenging for individuals. I'm a counsellor, and I do a little bit of work with people who've got some mental health problems, and I think it's that lack of certainty that can very quickly lead to anxiety and depression. I have ADHD, and I think for anybody that's been diagnosed with ADHD as an adult, they'll understand this, because you go through life thinking, well, if only I could concentrate a bit more, if only I could sit still a bit more, if only I could do all of these things. But the truth is you can't. And so you're dealing constantly with a world that's kind of unfair because it's not balanced towards you. It's that I can't fix this. And I think there's that sense as well. So I think it's very challenging when you're in a situation where your authenticity is not enough and the boundaries that were in place have suddenly been removed.
Yeah, I kind of got steered to something there that that you talked about, if only I could concentrate more, whatever, because that's what the world tells you.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most toxic things that happens, and it starts at school, is that our mainstream systems have, what they believe is the model behaviour, the model citizen, the model pupil, the model whatever. What our mainstream systems do is they are not truthful about, we only have resources to cater to a certain bandwidth. It doesn't say that, because what it needs to say is, and we can only cater to that bandwidth because the resources are limited, or because we're ignorant and we don't know, or we haven't got the time to learn, or whatever. And if you fall outside of that bandwidth, it's because we can't cope with it. Instead, what it says is, if you don't fall within that bandwidth of our resources or our capability, there's something wrong with you. And I'm looking at your face, and, I've been through it. I can see you've been through it. And I'm telling myself this will resonate with a lot of people. And that's the beginning, isn't it, of being able to say, actually, no, there's a limited amount of resources, wisdom, care, whatever it is. And all it's telling me is it can't accommodate me. Now, in our society, in order for those things not to impact on the society as a whole, so that sort of, predatory capitalists don't just sort of only take the cream of the cream and everyone else has to live on benefits, that we create laws so that you can have inclusion, so that people, we say workplaces need to reflect society, otherwise the burden falls on everybody else. So I really get that, but isn't it a shame it all has to be done by force and by law, and that we've lost our common humanity. And so, we haven't got a huge amount of time left for this episode, but I just want to use that to segue into, the way I hear you speak. I use the word eloquence, but it is authentic. And there is something where you've been able to distill. You've been able to distill all the dissonance and the mess. And there's always something to be grateful for. There's always something to be had. There's always something that you can move forward. And I just, I think this will be really useful to people listening to this podcast, if you can just share some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I was writing down a couple of things there because I just wanted to, there's two buckets of thought that I would share. And the first one is a takeaway from my Unilever days. And it's a quote by an author, a therapist, and a Holocaust survivor called Viktor Frankl, who very famously wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And the quote attributed to him is, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies a choice. And in that choice lies your growth and your freedom." And that's always resonated with me. And I think it probably resonates with everybody if you actually think about the words. We have a choice. You mentioned gratitude and compassion. And, when situations aren't going your way, or, if we're in a position of conflict with another person, we always have a choice about how we receive that and how we respond. Now, sometimes that choice isn't easy. And with my neurodivergent hat on and a slightly limited prefrontal and executive function, that choice can be smaller, but nevertheless, I can choose whether to respond with gratitude and compassion. And when I reflect back on that time at Unilever, that was always my intention, was to try and do that. I found it destabilizing and I didn't always get it right, but it really sustained me, was to keep going back and to be the most authentic version of me that I could be. I can't control anyone else, Maria, but I can control myself. And it is exhausting. And I think that definitely contributed towards the overall exhaustion that I felt at the end of that period, because I was as determined as I could be. That was my intention, was to be my authentic self. And the second one is, it's really simple. I am enough. And that's something that I've carried with me for quite a few years now. And we had a retreat, connections retreats last year. We did a pilot, the idea of bringing let's bring people together and let's explore what are those connections to sustainable happiness, to meaning. When we talk about resilience, what are the things that will sustain us on our life's journey? And it was a brilliant couple of days, and hopefully we'll do 2 more this year. But the WhatsApp group that I set up afterwards was called I'm Enough. And I think just recognizing this is not about saying I'm finished my journey. This is not saying I don't need any more personal development. This is not saying those things. What it's saying is that I am enough as my authentic person. And I shouldn't be looking at other people and thinking, if only I could be that person. Because I can be world class at being me. And Maria, you are world class at being you. You're fantastic. If I try and be you and you try and be me, I think it would be quite funny. It'd be like a comedy show, Maria, but I don't think we'd be very successful.
Hilarious. Amazing. Well, Adrian, this has been absolutely heartwarming and enlightening and joyful. And so if people, I say, oh, that guy sounds all right, I wouldn't mind knowing a bit more about him or finding out about his retreats, where are they going to find you? Where can people get some more of Adrian?
Well, on the glorious internet, www.purposeintoaction.org, and there's a bunch of stuff on there. There's a free on-demand training course where you can actually explore some of those connections. You can find out more about the retreat, and you can probably see me on a couple of videos as well.
That's amazing. I might show up at one of your retreats. You never know. Sounds wonderful.
That would be magnificent.
Thank you so much.